At first glance, both early modern France and Japan look like two completely different worlds. However, with a closer look, we could see that the court of the shogun in Edo and the court of the French king in Versailles shared a few interesting similarities. Let's dive into the complex world of the French and Japanese nobility and discover how they were subdued by a central power looking for preservation instead of annihilation. In both France and Japan, the control over the nobility was born from crisis and shared the same nucleus, power vacuum, albeit having different causes. Japan had an emperor, but he was essentially a moral and religious figurehead, not a head of state. The true power was in the hands of the shogun, a sort of military dictator who truly ruled the country. He was at the head of the daimyo, both local warlords and administrators. By the 15th century, the once powerful Ashikaga shogun had lost control over the daimyo, unable to quell the Onin War, thus sapping away the last bit of the shogun's capacity to maintain social order. The Onin War is often considered to be the event that started the Sengoku period or warring state period. For over a century, daimyo engulfed the country in an all-out civil war, completely turning upside down the social order and reshaping the relations between masters and servants, changing alliances according to daimyo's interests and political goals. After countless battles and succession disputes, the Tokugawa clan from Edo, nowadays Tokyo, secured the title of shogun, finally pacifying and unifying the Japanese archipelago under the power of one man at the dawn of the 17th century. On its side, France knew, a few decades later, quite a similar situation, albeit less violent and shorter in time, called the Fronde. In 1648, the country was exhausted after the 30 Years' War. During this European conflict, Cardinal Richelieu had already begun centralizing power around the French monarchy. At that time an infant, the future Louis XIV was obviously powerless when French nobles started to openly revolt against those governing in his place. Indeed, Louis XIV's mother, Queen Regent Anne of Austria, and Cardinal Mazarin, both foreigners, wished to make the French monarchy absolute. This met a strong opposition from both the French magistrates and nobility, who were willing to preserve their privileges and independence, thus refusing to be reduced from vassals to simple courtiers. Louis XIV grew up in this tense atmosphere of distrust of royal power and warring nobility, being forced to flee from Paris for his own safety. With time losing momentum and without clear leaders and goals, the Fronde struggled and stopped, leaving a permanent stain over the credibility of the French nobility. Growing up in this chaotic period, this strongly shaped the will of the French king to both never again let the nobility threaten the head of the state and centralize the power around himself, an aim also shared on the other side of the world, in Japan by the Tokugawa shogunate. Let's talk first about the main difference between Versailles and Edo, the coercion. Because of a practice called the Sankin-kōtai, officially both a ritual display of hierarchy and logistical redistribution system, the Tokugawa shogunate was in total control of the daimyo's every whereabouts. In practice, their full presence at the shogun's court was required by law. The daimyo were alternating between a year in their fief and another year in Edo. For their family, it was even more constraining, as the latter were forced to live in Edo permanently, thus making them, de facto, hostages. As former warlords, you might think the daimyo could refuse and enter into open rebellion. This was nearly impossible as at the end of the Sengoku era, the shogun was the most powerful man in Japan by far. To maintain social order, the Tokugawa could count on various organs of control to oversee the daimyo. The highest, just below the shogun, was the roju, or Council of Elders, receiving reports on daimyo's finances, domain governance, and unusual troops movement, to name a few. On the field, so to speak, were the inspectors, called the metsuke and ometsuke, charged to monitor low-ranking samurai, domain officials, and daimyos themselves. Strong with judicial powers, they looked for potential treason, military preparedness, and upkeep of castle defenses. Finally, the Atamoto and Gokenin, both direct vassals of the shogun, were stationed near daimyo's residences in Edo. Eyes and ears of the shogun, their allegiance was not a secret, and they gathered information by socializing with servants. As you can see, every part of the life of a daimyo was scrutinized, rendering the preparation of a rebellion highly unlikely. In France, however, the control of the king was more subtle. Louis XIV understood that there is no need to use strength, as you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And Versailles was the perfect honeypot with constant parties, balls, hunts, fireworks, and delicious meals. For a noble arriving and staying in Versailles, going back to its boring provincial life would be a stark and unpleasant contrast. Once attracted, nobles understood quickly that the physically closer you were with a king, the more privileges you had access to. This way of governing rendered meaningless a noble's prestigious military lineage, completely reshaping the notions of power and honor. The presence at the king's court was never made mandatory by any means, but became, with time, an essential prerequisite for every personal or political favor. Then, as you can imagine, behind the glitter, court life in Versailles was rigid, competitive, and psychologically draining. As we saw, the main characteristic between the French absolute monarchy, starting with Louis XIV, and the Tokugawa shogunate was the will to control the nobility without destroying or replacing it. This was, unlike, for example, Peter the Great in Russia, who, at roughly the same time, broke and rebuilt the Russian nobility to impose his legitimacy. To tame the warring nobility without crushing it, both Edo and Versailles would use, surprisingly, similar methods. The first element was to uproot the nobility from its power base. This way, outside their familiar area and local military network, nobles and daimyo were completely isolated, thus powerless. An isolated noble is a noble that can't rebel. Another way to control the nobility was by, figuratively, hanging them up with the strings of their purses. Living in Versailles was a bottomless pit of expenditures, as the courtiers were expected, for example, to follow the latest fashion. Card games and their counterpart gambling were also widespread, which caused many courtiers to fall into debt. The king was then the only one who could save the bankrupt noble. The latter has to personally come to the king and ask for a pension. Of course, this vicious circle was calculated, as this mark of generosity served to make the now humiliated but financially relieved and grateful noble even more dependent on the king. Ruining the nobility was also a strategy in Japan, as the daimyo had to maintain two households, one in their fief and one in Edo, and travel there with a full retinue, also a mandatory part of the Sankin-kōtai. This was, here too, a way to prevent money hoarding. A noble with just enough money to survive is a noble who can't rebel. In the hushed atmosphere of palaces, war wasn't waged with swords and katana anymore, but with whispers. Gossip about a real or imagined courtier's faux pas could ruin you socially in France and politically in Japan. An outdated outfit in Versailles or a wrong fabric on your kimono in Edo could make your long-earned reputation tarnished in seconds, as it was, in this environment, a priceless currency. This is also why nobles had no interest in returning to their fief. The farther they were from other nobles, the more impossible it was for them to manage their image. A noble kept too busy spying on others and caring highly about his reputation is a noble who can't rebel. Although a key difference to be noted was when a nobleman was noticed for its wit, taste and magnificence. In Versailles it was good taste. In Edo it was suspect. In short, French courtiers competed for proximity, while Japanese daimyo competed for conformity. For both, however, this domestication would, among many other factors, play a significant part in their downfall, as the world around them would be revolutionized. While the French and Japanese nobility were sheltered and caged, the world around them did not stop turning. Ultimately, this way of freezing nobility in time allows the creation of two different scenarios, both ending in bloodshed. In France, the stagnation of the nobility, stuck in Versailles, was all for the benefit of the urban bourgeoisie, formed by commoners working in liberal professions, seduced by new Enlightenment ideas. This, combined with progress in printing and climatic disasters, which caused general impoverishment and near famine, formed an explosive mix that shattered the French status quo. The French Revolution, which initially started by demanding the end of the absolute monarchy for a British-like parliamentary system, would be subverted by radical elements. The now targeted and undesirable nobility then took the road of exile if it hadn't been decapitated beforehand, breaking open the golden cage that was Versailles. For Japan, change came from the sea when American Commodore Perry forcibly berthed his infamous black ships in a bay of Edo, putting an end to the Sengoku, the self-isolation of the Japanese archipelago. 1843 was a harsh wake-up, as the land of the rising sun realized how far behind it was militarily. The Japanese weaponry was mortally obsolete against Western repeating rifles and steam-propelled iron warships. For over a decade, the shogun hesitated between tradition and modernization while abolishing the gradually weakened Sankin-kōtai in 1862, thus ending almost 230 years of surveillance over the Japanese nobility. Finally, it's the path towards modernization that prevailed. Under the aegis of Emperor Meiji, now ruling with restored powers, the imperial army crushed the resistance of the traditionalists during the Onin War. The last shogun, still from the Tokugawa clan, accepted his defeat and resigned in 1867. The Japanese imperial era, characterized by both frantic industrialization and military expansion overseas, thus fully began. Both systems succeeded brilliantly for a time. Both neutralized the warrior elite, but in doing so, they froze it until the overwhelming forces of a world in mutation destroyed it. Thank you for watching this video about power mechanics in France and Japan. More untold pages of history are on the way, so if you do not want to miss any, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. These, as you know, help tremendously. This is Forgotten Fragment. Until next time for the next story.